Other things in John that Jesus did, that he said, that were just really cool to me, that I think are really neat to look at, is just the I am statements. You remember some of them maybe. Jesus said throughout the Gospel of John, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. At one point, Jesus said, matter of fact, before Abraham was, I am. Now, the main focus of these stories is what's important for us today. The main focus of the gospel stories is what's important. As we look through any of the Gospels, but in particular the Gospel of John, we see what his main focus is in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31. And Pastor Roger led you in these verses last weekend at the very end of the message. But it's important for us to recognize this is John's purpose for writing his gospel, for putting this story together, where he says, now Jesus did many other things in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written, here's the important part, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You see, that's the point and the purpose of the Gospel of John. That's the point and the purpose of what he's written, so that we can get to know Jesus, so that we can know who he is in order that we can believe, and if we believe, so we can have life. It's a powerful story to me, and the main point is redemption. Redemption is God making a way for my sins to be paid for. Redemption is God making a way for me to be counted as righteous. Redemption is God making a way for me to be freed from the burden and bondage of sin. Redemption is God. Redemption is God's story. You know, the foundation of our message today, I want to just go back to that very last verse in the Gospel of John. And we look there in chapter 21, verse 25 again. I want to read it to you again. I want us to catch an understanding of what this verse really is kind of summing up for us. John has woven a beautiful ending to his book. Now, there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. Jesus did many other things. I wonder what they were. You know, it's understandable that if someone were to write a biography of your life or my life, that they wouldn't be able to get every bit of it in there. They'd tell some stories, then there'd be a little gap, and then there might be some other account, and there'd be a gap. There'd be some more narrative, but there'd be things that had to be left out. Now, reality shows today try to fill in everything when they videotape someone nonstop, but you know they still edit that stuff, right? It's not nonstop. You can't get everything. No one can live your life for you. I wonder what those other things that Jesus did were. What other things was he up to? Maybe someday in heaven we'll get a chance to sit down and say, hey, Jesus, there's this gap in the Gospel of John from here to there. What'd you do? Where'd you go from here? And how'd you get there? What'd you do in between Jerusalem and Galilee? What else happened on that journey? What else could you tell me, Lord? I want to know more about it. You know, the thing that's important for us today to remember is that God's redemption story is still being written. God's redemption story, the story that tells about the work of God, is still being written. It's being written in my life and in yours. God's redemption story is not complete. Because John finished his gospel, the work of the gospel is far from done. And it's not simply the fact today that Jesus did other things while he was on earth that we don't have recorded. The best part is that Jesus has been working for us since then. Now, maybe today, if you were to ask me the question, what makes up my life, I could give you some answers. And I could ask you the same thing. What is it that makes up your lives? We could all come up with some pretty simple answers. I mean, you might think about the different things that you do, basically. That's what we would think of. What is it that makes up my life? Well, I get up in the morning and I get some breakfast and I get ready and I go to work. But before I get there, I drop off the boys at school. I go to work, I hang out and do some stuff for a while. I go to lunch with the fellas and we have some fun times. And then I come back and do a little more work. Then I pick up the boys on the way home and Mama's got supper ready. And then we're washing dishes and feeding the dog and taking out the trash and going to bed and getting up and doing it all over again, right? Anybody have a story like that? That's what makes up our lives, right? And you might fill in the blank with some little bit different activities, but that's the way we would go about that. We would say, my life is made up of the activities that I do. But that's really not what your life is made up of. That's really not the thing that makes your life what it is. What makes my life is that I have a story to tell because of the redemptive work of God in my life. I have a story to tell, and that story is redemption. Now, I got to be transparent with you. When I was younger, I used to have a really hard time with my personal testimony. You know, we all kind of have think of our testimony, that's the story I can tell about myself as a Christian and what that matters and how that influences other people and how that might help them. But I used to really have a hard time with mine because I grew up in a Christian home. I'm a third-generation Restoration Movement Christian, you know, Chandler Christian Church kind of Christian. I'm not just, you know, Bible believer, but been in this kind of church all of my life, and my family has for generations. I never got arrested. I never have spent a night in jail. I never really got caught up in any of the things that seem to be those spectacular pieces of someone else's testimony. I couldn't say that God had freed me from this addiction, or God had delivered me from this life of sin that was horrible. I couldn't say that God had brought me out of some pit of darkness. At least I didn't think I could say that. As I got a little bit older, though, and I began to understand, no matter what your events are, no matter what your life history is, without Christ, we're all in the dark. We're all in the same pit of despair. We're all in the same place without Jesus Christ. And I have come to understand that my story is a beautiful story of redemption. Whether or not I've gone through some of the events that anybody else has gone through, my story is a beautiful story of redemption. So that's the question I want to ask today. The question I want us to look at today, and if you take out your little note sheet there, take it out of the worship folder, and turn it over, there's simply that question on the back side of it. What's your story? What's your story? What's it made up of? What are the things that go into your story? So now I want you to take out a pen from the pocket of the chair in front of you, or a pen from your purse or your pocket or wherever you have one. Go ahead and take one out, all right? Okay, come on, go. I'm just kidding. It's all right. I really want us to do this, okay? It's an activity for us to do together. Get a pen, get that page, turn it over, and get ready. Because we're going to work on some things that can make up your story. And I want you to take just a few minutes and jot down some bullet points of things that tell your story of redemption. There's going to be some words that show up on the screen here, and they're going to come in and maybe give you just some ideas, a place to start from, some things that you could be thinking of that you might be able to say, this is my story. These are the parts that make up what God has done in redeeming me. Okay? So does that make sense? Everybody kind of understand the instructions? I want you to jot some bullet points down that you can look back and say, here's where I was and here's where I am. Here's what I did and here's what God has brought me to. Okay? Take just a few minutes to let you do that. All right, a little fun there, but seriously, God's done a lot of work in our lives. You keep writing. Look at those things. Here's the words. Here's the ideas. Your story has incredibly important value. Maybe as you're trying to think and write some of those ideas down, you might just look back and think of a time that God brought you through. A period in your life when you know nothing else could have done it. Maybe you look back at a time when you really just sensed God at work in your life and sensed His presence there with you. Maybe you look back and you realize, you know, there used to be a void in my life, but now it's filled with something that God has put there.